Okay, so good day, everyone. And I'll be talking about um, the last part of the discussion on the completion of a research paper or thesis paper, particularly on chapters 4 and 5. So allow me to share my screen to everyone. Okay, so for this session, we will talk about how to present your data and your result and how to properly write chapters 4 and 5. So hold on, let me fix my audio. Okay, so like what I've said, we'll talk about chapters 4 and 5. So this chapter, particularly chapter 4, is the presentation of the result or results. And what you normally do as a researcher is to identify and interpret the major findings. You're also expected to discuss possible reason why those results occurred, whether it is quanti or quali. You also need to fit them into findings of previous researches. Either the researches that you found out is really supporting your claims, or it could also be against the expected result or expected theory. You will also suggest field application or theoretical interpretation. More often, you add to this section some implication of the result, and then you need to write and present some interpretation, speculation, or any ideas that would be out of place in the conclusion. So chapter 4 focus on the presentation, analysis, and interpretation of data. And this chapter presents the gathered data in tables and in text. It also includes the analysis and interpretation of the said data after utilizing appropriate statistical tools. So how is this related to chapter 1? So in chapter 1, where you presented your research question, it should also answer the question that you have presented earlier on. So, for example, if the research question is on the academic performance of college freshman students in college algebra, so you need to have a counterpart of that in chapter 4, which focuses on the academic performance of college freshman students in the college algebra. You will notice that instead of writing the question, you present in chapter 4 a declarative statement. So the second question in chapter 1 is there a significant difference in the performance of college freshman students in college when grouped according to sex, session, schedule, so on and so forth? So you will see here in chapter 4 that the heading becomes declarative. So instead of the question is there's a difference, you will now proceed to difference in the performance of college freshman students in college when grouped according to in the sub-themes or subcategories that you have identified. Aside from that, in chapter 4, you need to present the result. So for example, as shared on the screen, you include the table number, the summary table in sports celebrity idolatry level. These are the table for your presentation. That is where the statements in your survey questionnaires are also reflected. The WM is the weighted mean, and the VI represents the verbal interpretation. You'll also include in your table your legend. So, for example, what does it mean by this interpretation? And you use symbols or legends instead. Then, after presenting your data, you need to relate the findings with the findings of the previous studies. So, for example, as you presented the table, you already identify the interpretation, the overall weighted mean of that. And you need to give the reason for the overall weighted mean, give the result, and you need to include also the values, and the interpretation. Aside from that, you need to relate after stating the facts about textual presentation. You need to relate the findings with the findings of the previous studies. Either it supported your claims or it opposes your claim. And in the third paragraph, you need to relate the findings with the result of either interviews or other data or sources of data to triangulate your result. And then finally, in the last part of your paragraph, you give some sort of recommendation to further understand and appreciate the result that you have obtained. That's one way of doing that. Another way of doing is to give the subheading, for example, the effect level of the COVID-19 pandemic to college aerobics online teaching. And then you put the subheading, learners' characteristics, the table, and the result. And then here again, you present the actual data, and then you put some legend, you interpret the data in text, and then you make some analysis, and then result or relating the result of your analysis in the existing body of knowledge, and then make some sort of recommendation. That's another way of presenting your data. But if you're working on test of significance, you can also do it this way. So for the test of significance, you indicate what kind of correlation between certain values are involved. Example of that is correlation between the sports celebrity idolatry level and the sports involvement level. And then you make some paragraph introduction before you present your data. And then after that, you present your table and the actual data and indicate whether the variables, the result of the coefficient, the interpretation, the value, the p-value, and then the interpretation. When you present that, it must be followed by thorough interpretation or analysis or discussion. So these uh, example will tell you the thorough analysis of the statistical result. So you will notice that we are not just simply presenting the result, but rather giving further interpretation of the result. What's the meaning of the p-value? How is it related to your study? And how will it affect that no, in the future? Another way of presenting your result is by this, for example, the test of significance. So similarly, you give a little intro, and then you present the table, and then you do the pattern I have given you. No, you interpret the result on text, then support it with claims in the literature, and then suggest recommendation. So that is how we present quantitative data. What about if it's qualitative data? How do we go about it? In the qualitative data, if you listen to our lecture on quali, you can use that as part of your presentation. But it will also be this way, wherein you presented all the responses or the possible responses of the interview with your corresponding code or color coding. And then there's a code that will give the some sort of interpretation of the statement. And then later on, your categories and then your themes. So you will notice that part of chapter 4 is to present the actual data. However, because qualitative research is so rich in words, then you can just simply put that in your code book, or you can present a summary of the code book in the result, and then later on indicate in the discussion the nitty-gritty of that based on the appendix number or letter that you have used. Another way is, after presenting the qualitative result, you make some interpretation of that. What's the meaning of the code? How did you arrive with the code, with the categories, and then with the themes, and then further discuss that by quoting actual code or in vivo of the interview or the FGD. The next section of your thesis is chapter 5, summary, conclusion, and recommendation. For the summary, conclusion, and recommendation, this chapter usually includes a brief statement of the problem. It will also be a description of main features of the method, omitting most of the details concerning subject and measure. It is like a list of main findings and the writer's conclusion on recommendation based on the findings. So technically, this particular chapter synthesizes the entire result of the study. So usually in chapter 5, you have your heading, and then there's a short introduction presenting the chapter. So, for example, this chapter synthesizes the study of the sports celebrity idolatry towards improved sports involvement of Chinese high school students. It starts with the salient findings, followed by the conclusion and recommendation. So, notice, class, that when you talk about findings, these are often listed by the number relative to the RQs or the research questions, and they are major findings summarized in one or two sentences. Always remember that in this section, there is no more table, there is no more analysis, and no more interpretation. So how does it look like when you want to present that in chapter 5? So usually you present the summary. So for example, in our RQ1, where we talk about level of expected quality of teaching of students before enrolling in higher education or higher vocational college. So you put 1.1 as one of your sub question on expectation per majors, and then you present the result. For example, the overall weighted mean of 3.725 revealed the general status level of the expected quality of teaching of the students before enrolling in higher vocational college as to expectation for majors. For some institution, they highlight the actual, the real or the significant findings. So you will notice here what is the score of the weighted mean, what is the interpretation of the weighted mean, and what does it mean towards expectation for majors. Similarly, on expectation for teachers, so on and so forth. Another example is you present the summary, you put some heading, and then you put 1.1, 1.2, similar to this, and then the result. So for example, the level of sports celebrity idolatry of the participants, and then you have a short introduction presenting your result, and then 1.1, that's the first subheading, and then the result in 1.1, and then 1.2 subheading, and then the result of subheading 1.2 until you complete that. And then you put the summary as the main highlight of the entire result in RQ1. Now, if your study also obtain correlation, well, you need to compute for the R coefficient, and then later on make some interpretation about it, and then also inform the p-value. So for example, the R coefficient of 0.296 means that there was a positive, direct, low correlation between sports celebrity idolatry level and sports involvement level. With a p-value of 0.005 or 0.001, it manifests that the low positive relationship was significant. Another way of presenting it is this way. Like a while ago, I have given you examples on the groupings. So significant difference in the extent of practice of monitoring modes in selected university in profile variables. So you'll notice that there are 7 subheadings that were included. These include the age, the sex, employment status, department, educational attainment, years in teaching, and mentoring mode handled under the new normal. So you will notice here that in the summary, I just highlighted on the p-value and then the interpretation of that, and as to whether this is significant or not. So you can see that in item 2.1 all the way to 2.7. Next is conclusion. Conclusion should be specific. It should be based on a supported data or findings that was stated earlier in your discussion. It should be direct, valid, and reliable. And here, in conclusion, we do not expect to have more computation. So how do we present the conclusion in a thesis format? So it can be written this way. For example, based on the findings of the study, The following conclusion are hereby presented. So you will notice here in item number 1, the respondents are on high online learning experience level. So that is just our conclusion. And that can be further analyzed when you look at the result of your study. Second is the respondents exceed expectation in their online learning performance. So again, the nitty-gritty of these can be seen in the result, and the subcomponent of the result can be seen in the summary. Number 3, there is a significant high positive correlation between online learning experience and online learning performance. So notice it's just a general description of what happened in the experiences of the participants. So you can do that, no, but make sure that it should highlight only what we want to conclude. There will be no discussion or interpretation or analysis in the conclusion section. And finally, in recommendation, the recommendation are listed and should be based on the findings and conclusion. So what are the things that we need to remember? It should relate to the agencies or sectors investigated in the research. You should also focus on the functional or the functionality to the agency or sector concern of your research. It should also be diplomatic and suggestive voice. No, we do not impose something, but rather we want the readers to that they may consider the the result of your study, and that can be recommendatory. It should also suggest further evaluation and research. Another way of looking at recommendation is when you are doing that, we do not really assure that that can be a good pathways or suggestion, but rather it is just a suggestion for them to also verify and even evaluate the result of their findings. And the final recommendation should suggest topics for further study. So how does it look like, no, when we write it? So for example, recommendation based on the foregoing findings and conclusion, the following are hereby recommended for the teaching management personnel or colleagues or colleges and universities. So that's the first recipient of the study, and then you explain the reason why these can be recommendatory to them. Second, for the teachers in colleges and university, why is it needed or why is it important for them? For college students, for parents, and for future researchers. Notice that the impact is also based on our priority. Which one or which among the five obtained the highest impact in this particular study? And then you narrow it down, no, from top to bottom. Okay, so that is the end of our discussion on chapter 4 and 5. So your task is to use and ensure that you follow the standard I have given you. So that is the end of our lesson for today. Thank you for listening.